Yes, please.
Okay. So first of all, I have to ask you to forgive me for last Monday. My civil profession is sometimes very demanding, and I just didn't manage to get rid of an assignment. And now I have to ask you to forgive me that I'm completely computer illiterate, and the dog who is guiding me as a blind person through the street was not available. So please forgive me, and I'm trying to start right away. I would like to get to the, let me say, political, theoretical point of the exercise which I'm subjecting you to. And this exercise is basically captioned in the thesis that the current state of emergency and the state of emergency the world was subjected to following the financial crisis result in more or less one and the same structural entrenchment of certain structures of politics. And I would argue that this structure of politics consists in the entrenchment of a monetary system, which I would like to describe today. The way I want to tackle the argument is that I'm taking one decision of the European Court. I'm, of course, taking again the European Union as the area or the terrain on which I'm moving. And it is the decision of 2015 with which the European Court confirmed the powers of the central bank, of the European Central Bank, to engage in a program which was the so-called, or is the so-called OMT program, the outright monetary transaction program, whereby the European Central Bank announced, and with the decision of 2015 of the court, was basically confirmed to be authorized to buy state obligations on secondary markets. And this decision was highly controversial in Germany, and a variety of German citizens and the political faction of Die Linke in Bundestag challenged the powers of the central bank to acquire, even if on the secondary markets, state obligations. The challenge was to the Constitutional Court of Germany, and the Constitutional Court of Germany decided to apply to the European Court for a preliminary ruling whether the European Central Bank would be authorized to engage in this program. Now, this decision is very interesting and has many aspects. I'm interested in one aspect, which is the ultra-virus aspect, which has been put forward or put to the court. And the ultra-virus question, so the question whether the European Central Bank had exceeded its powers, the powers which the European Treaty conferred upon the central bank when announcing this program. And it refers to Article 119 of the treaty, which makes a distinction between monetary politics and economic politics. Now, in the structure of politics and in the constitutional system of the European Union, there is an important distinction between monetary politics and economic politics or economic policies, which is one of the cornerstones of, as I would call it, the neoliberal or neoconservative movement of the last 30 years. And it brings us to the discourse about the technical versus the political, and the political decision maker versus the expert or the technical decision maker as the figure which is legitimating certain decisions. And so a technical expertise versus politics as a field of decision making. I have tried to speak about this I've tried to make my point last week, or my points. One of these points is that there is no distinction, or there is no, in its effects, in its political effects, no difference between technical or political legitimation of decision making. But monetary politics versus economic policies. In the European Union, monetary policies, a field where the Union itself has powers, and economic policies still in the competence of the nation states. There is an important distinction. And the distinction of Article 119 of the European Treaty tries to separate one of the other. Now, any critical understanding of the relationship between monetary policies and economic policies will point to the intrinsic relationship of these two fields. I would argue that economic policies are a well-established field of political decision-making throughout the history of the 20th century in an overt way, but we understand that, this is not only a phenomenon of the last century or of the last two decades of this century. While monetary policy is always separated from political decision-making. So the European Court, when taking up this decision, this issue, had to decide and had to take a legal decision, had to apply law to discuss this distinction, and had to decide whether the European Central Bank, when starting or when announcing the OMT program, was encroaching upon the field of economic policies or not. The court decided that the European Central Bank has the right to engage in the OMT program, and that the OMT program would not be or would not amount to a transgression into the field of economic policies. Now, let me first explain to you the program, then the act of the central bank, which was subject to review, and then go into one, from my point of view, key argument of the preparation of the decision, which is the opinion of the Advocate General, which was which was at the basis of the decision. So the case number is C62/14 for those who want to look at it. And it is the case of Gauweiler, Bandulet and others, and also the faction of the Linke im Bundestag versus the Bundestag. Let me describe the program and let me describe the act which was subject to the ruling of the European Court in this regarding this matter. The OMT program was announced on the 6th of September 2012, and this is important, by way of a press conference, and the announcement was then put on the website, on the official site of the central bank. But the announcement said the legal acts necessary to engage in the OMT program shall be announced in the future by the central bank. Now, there was never an announcement of the legal acts. The central bank has never enacted these acts. Why? Because until today, the OMT program has never been started. So we have a decision of the European Court about something which has never been put into practice on the basis of an announcement of the European Central Bank by way of a press release. The press release refers to a decision of the Council of the European Central Bank, which was taken in the course of its meeting on 5 and 6 September 2012. Let me pause here for a second. From the point of...
Leo, sorry about that. Can I just interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
It would be possible to tell us the name of the case that was difficult to get?
No,
and
it was not. The case is, should I?
Yes, please, spell it.
C, the case number is C/62-14.
Okay.
And it is Gauweiler, G-A-U-V-E-I-L-E-R, and others against Deutsche Bundestag.
Okay, thanks so much. And also OMT is, can you make the acronym? What the OMT means?
Yes, outright monetary transactions.
Outright monetary transactions. Thank you very much, sorry.
What I will explain it, yeah? So, and it's important that you understand the case was brought with the German Constitutional Court. The German Constitutional Court said the OMT was an encroachment upon the constitution of Germany. So the sovereignty of the people, as represented by the Bundestag, was endangered, and the German Constitutional Court presented the question to the European Court, and the European Court decided this question, and it's a very interesting decision, but much more interesting is the opinion of the Advocate General on all these levels. And I'm not picking one because I'm interested in the issue of decision-making in the state of emergency, and this is the ultra-virus aspect. So the question whether the central bank has stepped outside its authority when, and now we have to say, conceiving of this OMT program, because there's never been enacted, okay? But it is very, very important from my point of view for establishing a constitutional hierarchy and for defining a constitutional moment past financial crisis. And I would argue that this moment is now prolonged into the current crisis, even if now we are dealing with a pandemic and then we were dealing with the financial crisis. Now, the OMT program is a program whereby the central bank announced to acquire state obligations, and this is important, on the secondary market. The distorted constitutional system of the European Union would not allow, nominally not allow, the central bank to directly acquire these obligations from the state which is issuing these obligations. So private participants in the market, funds, banks, and others would have to acquire these obligations, and then the central bank can acquire on the secondary market these obligations. And what did the central bank say? It says, in order to lower the refinance margins of certain states in trouble, certain states who faced a financial meltdown, I would say, following the financial crisis, we, the central bank, are going to throw as much money as needed to the markets so that the risk margins which the states are going to pay when refinancing themselves can be lowered. Now, the acquisition of these state bonds, these titles, were, however, subject to conditionality. So only bonds or obligations of states who were already part of the EMS program, this is the European Stabilization Mechanism program, or the European Stabilization Facility, could be acquired. This is important because the conditionality amounts to the austerity programs, which were, from my point of view, destroying many of the countries who found themselves in difficulties following the financial crisis. So the decision to acquire bonds was subject to the agreement of states whose bonds were introduced into, would have become part of the program, to surrender to the conditionalities of the stabilization mechanism, of the stabilization facility, which the European Union put in place. So in order for you to understand what this means, I just say Greece, okay? And then the funds put into this program had to be, and this is now a technical term, sterilized. What does this mean? If the European Central Bank puts funds into a program, so to acquire certain state obligations, it would have to neutralize this, quote, investment, unquote, or this use of funds by selling assets, let's call them assets in another program, so that the participation of the central bank or the exposure of the central bank on one side would be neutralized by reducing the exposure on the other side. Now, what was the reasoning of the central bank? It is necessary to allow states to refinance themselves at acceptable rates. If this would not be possible, the entire euro system would be in danger. Because inside the eurozone, the difference between states in need of funds and who were not able to refinance them at acceptable costs, and those states who were able to refinance themselves as acceptable costs, would be a huge strain on the system. Now, several remarks at this point. The first remark is, it is extraordinary, but to a certain extent in line with jurisprudence of the European Court, that the European Court takes up an announcement on a website and deals with this announcement as a legal act. And the reasoning for this can be reviewed. This is not what I'm now concerned with. Much more important from my point of view, let me step back one moment. But we understand that an announcement of the central bank is an instrument of policy making by the central bank. So for those who have followed the development after 2010, it became very clear that the traditional instruments of central bank interventions were failing. So unconventional or non-conventional interventions were needed. And what's very important in the context of the decision which I'm speaking about, but the development of the interventions of the central bank is, and this can be found also in the opinion of the Advocate General, is that public statements are an important instrument of intervention. In this case, public statements by the central bank. Now, in parentheses, I don't know whether you are in the unfortunate situation that your government is experiencing now appearing now every day on TV and explains some measures. In Austria, we are in this situation that the government basically is having a press conference every day and announcing something and speaking about something useful, not useful, etc. But it is very clear that it shapes the way an entire nation, an entire country speaks about the crisis, and by doing so, it creates a discourse which is normative in terms of interpreting and understanding the current crisis. So the way an institution with power and decisional power is discussing a situation is of normative power in the context in which we are now finding ourselves. And this is a basic truism of any critical theory like critical legal studies, that we have always said it is the way we speak about law which shapes law. And therefore, it is a law-making exercise. So the way the central bank of the European Central Bank is discussing its intervention, announcing its intervention, even prior to engaging in a program, shapes the expectations on the market. And this is now an important issue, because the question is whether this is already economic policy or still monetary policy. And here I would like to refer to two paragraphs, which I'm taking now the freedom of reading to you. Usually I hate reading in lectures or at the occasion of such discussions, but these are two very important paragraphs which I would like to bring to your attention. When speaking about the powers of the European Central Bank, and when defining the grounds on which the European Central Bank is engaging in this program, and now I have to find it. Please bear with me for a second. It is here. These are the paragraphs 111 and 112 of the opinion of the Advocate General, who says the following: the ECB must accordingly be afforded a broad discretion for the purpose of framing and implementing the Union's monetary policy. The courts, when reviewing the ECB's activity, must therefore avoid the risk of supplanting the bank by venturing into a highly, and please pay attention, technical terrain in which it is necessary to have an expertise and experience which, according to the treatise, devolves solely upon the ECB. Therefore, the intensity of judicial review of the ECB's activity, its mandatory nature aside, must be characterized by a considerable degree of caution. This was 111. Now 112. Finally, it is important to point out that the ECB's monetary policy is implemented, as has been noted, through various transmission channels or mechanisms by means of which the bank intervenes in the market and fulfills its mandate of ensuring price stability. So what the Advocate General is saying here is basically, it is up to the central bank, by virtue of the central bank's expertise and experience, and I'll get to this in a second, to engage in programs and in reviewing the powers of the central bank conferred upon the central bank by the European treaties. We must be careful because it's actually only the central bank which can judge whether its action is appropriate, which means in line with the powers conferred upon it by the treaty. Now, watch out, experience. The central bank had no experience with OTM comparable interventions when announcing the program. It was the first time that such a program was announced. So what it really means is the expertise of the central bank cannot be challenged. Now, I don't want to get into this. I just mention it for the architecture of my argument, that you know that the European Central Bank is amongst all the institutions of the European Union, which from my point of view are not or scarcely legitimated through democratic proceedings, is the one which is absolutely autonomous. And the statute of the European Central Bank makes exactly this point, and the treaties too. So what we are seeing is that in a state of emergency, an institution, which means the European Central Bank, arrogates powers or exercises powers which within the overall institutional system is immune from critical review, which is outside the expertise used by the central bank. And it is the way the central bank publicly discusses its programs and hence its powers, which is normatively shaping the context for the interventions of the central bank. I don't want to get into this important issue now because it's not my argument, which I want to make, of monetary policies and economic policies. From a critical point of view, this doesn't stand. It would be worth a long discussion, but this distinction must be criticized. And if you read the opinion of the Advocate General, he's very careful. He's very careful about this, although of course he comes then out on the side of, yes, the distinction stands and the European Central Bank does not encroach upon the territory of economic policies. Now, in its substance, this does not only uphold, it entrenches the monetary system of the European, the monetary system as it shapes within the European Union, as it shapes within the Eurozone, but the way money is created and used in our economic and political systems. What do I refer to? And it's also somehow already inherent, the structure of the OMT. Money is not a public good in our economies. Money is a speculative resource. And the way money is sourced is at the origin of this characterization of money and the functionality of money. And it is basically at the origin of the financial crisis. Money in our systems is sourced through private actors. It is created by private actors. in lending operations, but the public hand is guaranteeing this issuance of money. This is, for me, a key element and a alternative economic policy must start there, and the democratization of the economy must start there. The criteria for the sourcing of money must be others than simple profit criteria. In our system, the criteria for sourcing money are private gains and private interests. Now, in order to change the way money operates and the functionality of money, the society must take back the decision as to organized society, must take back decision as to the quality and quantity of money which are being used in our economies and in our social systems. Now, the same applies today. What are the interventions, the key interventions in the current state of emergency and in this pandemic? It's the use of resources. And we all live in the miraculous world that all the money which was not available a year ago or half a year ago for certain initiatives and certain programs, all of the sudden can now be sourced, and it is the state which guarantees the sourcing of the money. So be sure that once this pandemic is somehow under control, and I would not then conclude that the state of emergency is somehow disappearing. I would say parts of the state of emergency are going to be normalized. There will be the same effect as we have seen after the financial crisis. Austerity will pay for the state of emergency. We see this already today in the way the programs are shaping. There's a disproportional use of funds for certain economic activities versus investments into the social system, in the educational system, as they are now needed in order to get through the current state of emergency. So what I would be arguing is that the current state of emergency is going to have the same effects as the state of emergency following the financial crisis, and that at the end it stabilizes and reinforces a hierarchy of markets whereby the financial markets are the leading markets, and all other markets are following the logic of the reproduction of the financial system. To use or to paraphrase a statement of Roberto Anger, once again, the financial system will not be assisting, but it will be dominating the economic system with all the negative effects on social, environmental, etc. Developments. And we see that that economics is reduced to a decision-making, which, to the extent it is decision-making in the field of monetary policy, comes across not as a political decision, not even as a legal decision, not even as legal decision making, but as the area of expertise and the institutions, or the institution, when we are speaking about our system in the European Union, which is called upon to decide, is the European Central Bank by way of its expertise. And I think that it is up to us to challenge this entire structure. But the aim is not to simply deconstruct this kind of reasoning. I think that the key intervention now is to attack the monetary or monetaristic constitution of the political system, and to have a discussion about the democratization of money and alternative sourcings of money. I would like to stop here and would be very interested in the discussion.
Okay, so the floor is open. Unmute yourselves when speaking, please. Also, whoever has a bad connection can write on the chat his or her question, and I will repeat it for Leopold.
I would like to ask you a question to start, if you don't mind, and it has to do with it's kind of a doctrinal question, but I'm interested in that even if it's doctrinal. Okay. In the US, we have a doctrine that is called political question that doesn't allow justiciability in cases in which certain areas are the domain of politics. That notion assumes a distinction between politics and law and constructs law as a domain of technical expertise, whereas politics is a domain of discretionary judicial making. That is a constitutional doctrine in US law and is derived from the case and controversy provision of the Third Amendment of Article 3 of the Constitution. In Italy, we have a system of public property that considers a political question every issue of privatization. In other words, there is no justiciability when a government in office decides to sell public property in order to take care of internal needs of organization of government. Okay, so privatization cannot be challenged in a court of law, and that is actually once more a doctrine that is constructed on the domain of the political as different from the domain of the legal. The domain of the legal occupies the issue of expropriation in the public interest, that is to say, of taking of property from the private into the public, but it is the domain of the political that governs the transfer of property from the public into the private. This has been a huge structural adjustment, not just in Italy, but throughout liberal constitutionalism. There is no state in no liberal democracy that doesn't work on this assumption that comes back from the French Revolution. Okay, the whole commons movement moved and was motivated, at least in its Italian version, that was the one most linked to the issue of privatization. It moved from this question, challenging the political question in privatization and introducing some sort of possibility to introduce technical control, legal control on what's happening when governments privatize. Now here what you're telling us, and it's very, very interesting actually, is that the European Court of Justice has created a doctrine of financial question. In other words, has produced one further layer in the division of the technical expertise, carrying it far away from the political. In other words, not only the law has developed its own technical skills different from the political ones, but now the financial has developed its own skills, technical, which are different both from the legal ones and from the political ones, and is shielded against both. Is that what you're saying?
This is one aspect of what I'm saying, yes.
Okay,
But
this seems to me an exceedingly important question. And let me, so if this is at least one side of what you said and I got it right, because, you know,
but I would,
then the question is, and it's more in terms of what should we do in terms of radical challenge of the status quo. Should we actually challenge the technicality of the argument, or should we actually maintain the technicality on the argument, attracting it within a different kind of technicality, which is the technicality of the law? In other words, how are we getting, what is the easier way? Of course, the ideal would be go back, let's claim back, you know, sovereignty over financial, over production of money. But I wonder whether there is, in your opinion, any sort of intermediate strategic counter-hegemonic move which deploys legal technicalities in order to claim back control over the production of money? That's my question.
Well, this is an extremely interesting question, and I'm not sure whether my reasoning will now be satisfactory to you. But I would approach the question in the following way. I still believe that radical critique, so a critique which goes to the roots of an issue, must also have or contain an element of immanent critique. So I'm very interested in taking up all these distinctions and all these technical or pseudo-technical arguments and verify whether they are coherent in themselves coherent. Because I think that it will demonstrate that many of the arguments are just moves of legitimation. I think that we have to do with central bank interventions the same what we have done with law. And not be substantialist in dealing with law, but to show the interests, to define to a certain extent the open-endedness, etc., 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 of legal norms, but also of all these interventions. I give you an example, okay? The European Central Bank is called upon, its task is to stabilize the price system for money. And to keep prices in the economy stable, which is done through the pricing of money in a traditional approach of central banking. Money costs more or money costs less. The refinance rates are higher or the refinance rates are lower, also due to the refinance costs which banks have when quote, acquiring money, unquote, from central banks. So the refinance rate of the central bank is a price mechanism. Now, the crisis of 2008, 2009 happens amongst, amongst other reasons because the central bank interventions proved not to have these results. This led to the entire discourse in the United States and in Europe of non-conventional central bank intervention. If you read the brief of the central bank and the very interesting opinion of the Advocate General, then their argument is, in order to uphold the price stabilization mandate of the European Central Bank, we must violate or we must engage in something else because this mechanism proved not to be sufficient. This is an internal contradiction which needs to be exploited, which needs to be used, and there are many others. The distinction between economic policy and monetary policy in modern political economy doesn't stand. So my first answer is, I think it is necessary to engage in an immanent analysis. My second argument would be, we have nothing gained if we supplant one technical argument with another one. So if we reject the technical side of the argument of made by the central bank, if we show the from my point of view, false fetishization of the expertise of the central bank, and then end up with law taking its functional position, we have gained very little. The constitution of the Treaty of the European Union confers a certain power onto the European Court, and therefore we have now this tension between a legal argument and a non-legal argument, both of which present themselves as non-political. But the next move which I would do is not to reduce all these to politics, but to show the political consequences and also to show the intrinsic relationship between this kind of lawmaking and this kind of central bank decision making with certain policies or politics. And in the case of the OMT program, this is the reason why I like to speak about it. It becomes obvious because one condition for participating in the OMT program is that a state subjects its economic policies to the austerity measures of the European stabilization mechanism. More political than this is not possible, but it is presented as a technical argument.
Okay, we have a question from Sasha Stojanovic, who's in New York with a bad connection. Leo, in your opinion, should a political struggle for a different way of money sourcing focus on introducing a mechanism that would politically decide on sourcing on the European level? Or the lack of democratic procedures within the institutional design of the European Union makes that impossible and necessitates that we focus on the member state level.
Well, this is a very complex issue. I think that we have to challenge the way money is sourced, and we have to do so on the European level. And the political struggle is for a different sourcing and for a different mechanism of supplying money into the economic system. It doesn't make sense to have the monetary supply of our economic, and then you have to be clear that this is not just, you know, the businesses, etc. This is the economic, the social, the cultural, etc. system in Europe, centralized in an institution which is extracted from any system of democratic control, and at the same time say the economic policies are within the power of the nation state. Social policies are within the power of the nation state. Taxes are decided on the levels of the nation state. I think that we have to centralize certain powers, but we have to struggle for a different mechanism of money sourcing, and we have to fight for a different system of supplying money into the economic system. From my point of view, it's a total absurdity that in my country, billions and billions of euros, I think 3 billion euros now, are made available to deal with the economic effects of the pandemic, to create programs which are administered by commercial banks based upon state guarantees and are costing money which the banks earn. So, to give you an example, there's a program now in Austria whereby, on the basis of a state guarantee, solvent businesses can finance up to 6 months of their costs of doing business, based upon a guarantee of the Republic of Austria, which covers 100% of these funds, guaranteeing a commercial bank, which charges 75 basis points for the money. Why this could not be administered by the Ministry of Finance, I can't understand. Why the margin of 0.75% plus the costs which are always coming along with entering into a loan agreement must be paid into, and I would argue, private channels, I cannot understand. So these kinds of mechanisms must be challenged, but we must have a discussion about the money sourced and guaranteed by the public hand, and we must struggle for criteria of using these funds to the benefit of a society which, in order to be capable of benefiting from such a new, a different, and alternative mechanism of money sourcing, itself must be highly politicized. itself must be characterized what Roberto Anga calls high energy politics. And this high energy politics requires that we also think through and we conceive of new mechanisms of democratic participation and decision making. But this is where I think the struggle of the future has to be.
Thank you, Leo. I can see that Christina has a question to put.
Thank you, Professor, for the presentation. My question is just more to understand, maybe just taking a step and understanding how you see the post-crisis relationship between monetary policy actions as well as the growth in the shadow banking system. So if you could possibly just explain how you see that relationship first. And then if I understand correctly, you're basically saying that we should, the system should step away from sort of its reliance on the shadow banking system and move more towards a democratic, a more democratized way of sourcing money. And I just want to understand how you envisage the institutional architecture for that.
Now, when I was speaking about money sourcing through private, by private actors, I was not referring actually to the shadow banking system. I was actually referring to the commercial banks. Yeah, the shadow banking system, or the creation of liquidity outside the regulated banking sector is one of the reasons why the traditional mechanism of central banking mechanisms of central banking interventions failed prior to the financial crisis, and I would argue is one of the reasons why a lot of the funds which are being created in the regulated parts of the financial system are not invested in economic activities, but in speculative activities. For now, I see the following move. And this move entails a institutional reference, at least. Money should be sourced by states. And the private banking system, or the commercial banking system, to the extent it is guaranteed by the public hand, deposit insurance, etc., 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 would have to acquire money from the state. This would be a huge income for budgets of the public hand. And this money in the regulated and guaranteed sector this should be money these should be funds which should be in the center of the discussion of financial activities. And I would not forbid other speculative dealings, but I would not guarantee them. So investment banks, funds should engage in speculative activity where they find space to do so. But they must be separated, and they must be distinguished from those economic activities for which the state in final instance always had to intervene through budgetary, with its budget. So I would stabilize the sourcing of money, and I would reduce the guarantees of the state to those sectors which are first regulated, and then I would give incentives for financing economic or other activities which correspond to a direction of development of a social system which is politicized and is permanently engaging in a discussion about this development. So the restructuring of the economy so that economic activities conform to the needs of environmentally sound developments could be such an example. Or to change the educational system could be another example. I think this would be a move which has a certain institutional base already. The discussion about sourcing of money through states or by states is a discussion which has tradition. And I think it would be the first useful step in a direction which I have outlined.
Thank you, Leo. There is a question from Mariella. Mariella, you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor, for the lecture. There is a lot of talk out there that governments need to implement Keynesian policies to fight this crisis because it's like a war effort. But the kind of Keynesianism that has been implemented is towards giving money to private corporations, and for the little guy, for the little companies, giving loans through banks. So what is your opinion on this issue? Because there is a clear clash there. I don't know if Europe is following another path different from the US, but from my point of view, and also what I've been reading on Stiglitz and all the economists out there, this is not Keynesianism. Keynesianism is not efforts to transfer money from the public straight to the private sector and the biggest corporations in the private sector. So thank you. If you can clarify this.
Well, your question goes to the point, or to this, I would say, very simplifying idea that there's a crisis, we go through the crisis, and then we reach normalcy. And the question for me is, which kind of normalcy? And from my point of view, the status quo ante, before the crisis, is not a desirable status. It's not a desirable situation. So from my point of view, the interventions which are now taking place are nothing but, on the one hand, ossifying an economic system, business models, a financial system, but I'm not talking about this now, also limiting freedoms and liberties, pushing society more and more in the direction of more authoritarian organization. The way these programs are structured, and I try to follow the developments in the United States, but I would not feel comfortable speaking about it. But I see what's happening in the European Union. Are just trying not only to get to a point as it may be described as a point prior to the crisis, but to use the crisis to institutionally strengthen the status quo ante, which from my point of view is not desirable.
Thank you, Leo. There is a question now by Gelaila, and then Bereket will follow.
Ciao, Professor. That was a very interesting lecture. Thank you. I hope you can hear me. I'm neither a lawyer nor an economist, so my question is going to be very future oriented and as well as very political science oriented as well, because that's my background. So from class, because I'm attending IUC, we've been learning about the normative values and the normative roles of institutions so far. And I was wondering, by adding this technical layer and by claiming that institutions are moving away from the political, but still the political is there, do you think the identity of institutions is being altered? Or the way how they see themselves and others see them, for instance, other institutions elsewhere in the world? And as a second question, do you think at different layers of analysis, whether it's a regional, international, or local level, do you think this whole emergency situation will culminate into a clash of institution type of scenario? And third, because I aspire to be a policy analyst someday, like 10 years or so, what would you recommend to those that would soon recommend policies to leaders in such circumstances?
I didn't understand the last question.
What would you recommend to future policy analysts, such as me in the future, yeah?
Well,
that's it, thank you.
I feel highly incompetent to answer the third question. To your first two questions, I actually believe that the political landscape is now shaped in a way to put forward once again a false alternative. And the false alternative is populism versus expertise. So I don't need to tell you or to describe my disdain for the current president of the United States. But he's described and criticized as a populist. And when he goes on TV and recommends absurd things in the context of this pandemic, it is only contrasted by his lack of reliance or non-reliance on the opinion of experts. And so we see how, and the same is in this is a trait which is important also in the context of European policies. And there we even see that an economic expertise or a business expertise is very often posed against so-called populist positions. In other words, and then I have to make another step. Very often, populists are those who are somehow criticizing the way the system functions. So the critique of the system is populist, while any argument in support of the current system is technical. And this perpetuates a juxtaposition which we have inherited from the big political confrontations of the last century and of the 19th century, etc., etc., etc. And the institutions, for example, of the European Union, even the parliament, see themselves, to the extent they are political, as institutes of transmission of expertise, or even as expert institutions. Okay? So the ridiculous talk in Italy always about a government of experts. Yeah? So the government of experts is the best synthesis of expertise is political. Yeah, we had the same. We had the same when our right-wing, extreme right-wing party was caught stealing, and the deputy prime minister had to resign, and the conservatives took the stage, and then the government fell. All of a sudden, we had a transition government in two stages. One was a government of experts, and then there was a government of experts. Okay, so what I'm seeing is that there is a from the base of expertise or on the grounds of expertise, there's a rejection of the political, and the political is associated with the populist movements which are criticizing the system. And what it basically means is that the center, and for example, the so-called center left, is giving up on politics. Yeah? So giving up on politics as a medium and a means of initiatives are only legitimate to the extent that they are camouflaged as expert initiatives. And this is a juxtaposition which we cannot accept. And we have to strongly advocate for very traditional mechanisms of participation, clear statements of interests, and constantly develop new grounds and new ways of intervention and participation. So we must rescue the political and must put it in the center stage of the discussion.
Thank you. There is Bereket with a question, and then we will have room for another question. Okay, a very last question, whoever wants to.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the thought-provoking presentation. If I have correctly understood you, I think you said that the near future will be dominated by financial institutions and along with their negative side effects. So my question is, could you please expand on the negative side effects of these financial systems dominated economies, and also what regulatory responses do you expect from governments, or what regulatory responses should governments take to deal with this type of economies?
Well, unfortunately, I do not see that, for example, in Europe, governments are really trying to act against this logic, against this development. But my answer is very short in the respect of what I expect. I expect the same as we had after the financial crisis. I expect a gruesome and brutal regime of austerity. And I expect that as soon as possible, which means as soon as it does not lead to public unrest, the institutions of the European Union and the institutions of the member state will go back to fiscal conservatism, reducing social and other programs. I mean, all this we have seen in the last 10 years. And would the pandemic not have happened, these lines of development would have continued. So I think from our point of view, or from my point of view, we can already indicate what's around the next corner, because we have seen it in the last few years, particularly following the financial crisis. We don't hear you.
Okay, Leo, thank you. There are no other questions. Thank you so much for...
a very quick last one to close, if it's possible at all, just to sum up a little bit, which I think this should become actually a matter of some collective thoughts in this line, because I'm all for, of course, a return of the political, and I'm all, of course, for trying to design a new political. However, I think that there is a risk in the analysis of claiming the return of the political when the political has produced such a despicable class of ignorant that took over office. And there is a risk that our claim of political is completely delegitimized by the sort of confusion between the universal suffrage and the level of the ruling class. And this to me is a big question, because I think that that political systems that are not ruled by parties, maybe they should not be single unique parties. I'm not necessarily for that, but I'm not against that in principle. But I think that system based on competitive parties, which don't work as chains and schools of political cadres, of people that actually know how to do politics, but actually just work as advertising platforms for tycoons or for other people that happen to be famous in that moment, is not going to be the solution of anything of this. So if the return of the political is to have the kind of prime minister you guys have in Austria, or the kind of the one we have in Italy, or the one they have in the US, I mean, this all kind of political class that is basically a class of people that have nothing to do with politics, that with very little political experience except some fame, either in business or in other areas. To me, that's a problem, is not a solution. Might be even a worse problem, because the political may emerge a ruling class that is technical in their way of thinking, but too stupid to be important in the technical skills. Okay? So this to me is something that we really have to discuss. How do we construct a party that is again an avant-garde, which is again some place in which actually there is a selection of the fittest to rule in a way that is courageous, free, and competent? That's to me the political, and that's to me the challenge of a program of academic programs, because otherwise we claim the return of the political is sexy and gauchiste, but in practice is even, the stick is worse than the wound.
Well, I would only say the following. Our prime minister is claiming not to be political, in the sense that the political is conflict. And what I think is needed is political conflict, positions which are not only in competition but even antagonistic to a certain point of time, but with an ability to make use of the expertise for the purpose of implementing politics. I see all over Europe, with few exceptions, political decision makers who are trying to portray themselves as anti-conflictual, non-political, and non-populist. And I think this could give us some room for defining better the kind of politics which we want to advance.
So thank you again, Leo. Let's hope to meet again soon, not after years, as it was the last time. Thank you for this illuminating couple of lectures. Next Monday, on May 4th, at 1400 Central European Time, Ugo will talk on From Citizens to Patients, a Threat to Resist. And I hope to see you all there. Thank you again. Goodbye.